And now it's my pleasure to introduce Charles Brass. My apologies, Charles. Charles Brass is a futurist, which he tells me means he works with people and with organisations to help them explore the sort of world in which they'd like to live and work and what might need to be done to create that world. Charles is the chairman of Australia's premier futures organisation, the Futures Foundation, which anyone with any interest in creating Australia's future should be able to join. The Futures Foundation helps governments, corporations, communities and individuals use a variety of futures tools and techniques to explore and then create probable, possible and preferred futures. Charles says that he's had 4 careers in his 21 plus years, from small business entrepreneur to school teacher, corporate executive and finally now futurist. His qualifications include an honours science degree, various educational qualifications, an MBA and a Master of Strategic Foresight. And like most good men, he said he's learned more from his wife and 3 children than he ever learnt at school. We've invited Charles to challenge our thinking today as he takes us on a brief journey into the future of work. Please join me in welcoming Charles.
Thank you, Tanya. In many ways, this presentation has been in preparation for over 20 years. And it's rather appropriate that it's taking place at an ARI convention because in its early days, ARI sponsored a project that I was an integral part of called Australians at Work in 2020. This was a time in the early 90s when questions around the future of work were beginning to be raised. Technology, such as it was at the time, was causing people to think about what might happen as the world unfolded. And as many people know, the 90s is always a time for millennial thinking, so lots of people were looking forward and creating visions for the future, and ARI was no exception. But ARI wasn't by any means the only organisation interested in this topic. There were all sorts of people making all sorts of comments and suggestions about what the future of work might look like. Some of them were highly utopian and promised us wonderful sounding futures in which we'd get all of our work done so quickly that we would hardly need to go there at all. We'd be able to enjoy the fruits of our labour working a very short period of time. Others presented a rather more dystopian view, suggesting that perhaps technology might be having such an impact that the nature of the world itself, the world of work itself, was changing. And to have a look at these headlines from this year, it seems that this is still a live topic in 2014. We've seen huge numbers of headlines about jobs disappearing and about various other changes that are taking place in the world of work, and seen whole industries on the brink of disappearing from Australia. It's not just newspapers that have been providing this. There's all sorts of research having a detailed look at the nature of this problem. And some of that research suggests that perhaps as many as 2.7 million Australians are affected by these changes in ways that they don't find particularly positive. It's not just Australia, it's a global phenomenon, as this article from The Economist suggests. Although The Economist focused particularly on young people and the difficulty that young people around the world were finding getting into work. Since most of us aren't young, it might be interesting to know why that is. It's all our fault, because we're not leaving jobs as fast as we once did, because, according to this research, we're afraid that if we do, we'll be the next on the heap. One of the fears people have at work, apparently, is that if they do lose or leave their job, they won't find another one. And for that reason, they're tending to stay rather longer. But to return briefly to young people, we've seen the controversy in this country where our government suggested that the problem for young people was just one of application and dedication, and that all they needed to do was apply and the world would come running. And we've seen various critiques of that, suggesting that perhaps the problem goes a little deeper than that. And just most recently, we've seen a bit of flack when the unemployment rate suddenly gave a glitch in July, and people started again wondering what was happening in the world of work. So it seems reasonable to ask the question, is there a future? If this has been debated for at least 20 years, is there a future for jobs? Well, like everything else, it depends. Doesn't matter which political party you listen to, as far as they're concerned, the only problem is that you aren't listening enough to them. As far as they're concerned, and it doesn't matter which political party it is, the solution is simply elect them and their set of policies will make the requisite changes, and all of the difficulties that we face will disappear because they have their hands on the levers of power. And our faithful public servants diligently compile websites such as this, in which they minutely analyse the country and identify places where there are vacancies, places where higher churn exists, where you're more likely to get a job even if there's not a vacancy at the moment, and they publish those for all sorts of people so that we can all move around as necessary to take advantage of the opportunities which the government have promised us are there. It's not just politicians and bureaucrats. Researchers look seriously into this problem, and researchers have decided, many of them, that all sorts of jobs are being created in all sorts of places, different ones in different parts of the country. And our own magazine regularly reports on jobs that will exist in 2050 that don't yet exist. And many people will tell you about the jobs that exist in 2014 that didn't exist in 1990. Everybody's favourite journalist, economist, Ross Gittins, is absolutely convinced that there's no problem. This is how he summarised it in his headline. But there's a reason why Ross Gittins said in that headline, the jobs will come back, they always have, because on the other hand, there is a long history of questioning what's happening in the world of work. One of the early industrial entrepreneurs in industrial England was a man called Andrew Urey. He made a fortune in the early days, and as distinct from many of his colleagues who just went and spent their fortune, he actually wrote a philosophy of manufacture. And one of his suggestions in his book was that the perfect manufacturing operation would be one that didn't have any people at all. And there's a long history of Nobel Prize winners who've made comments of a similar nature. The first of those was John Maynard Keynes in 1930, who said that we're being afflicted by a new disease, which he called technological unemployment, by which he meant unemployment due to our discovery of means of economising on the use of labour at a pace that outran our capacity to find new uses for labour. 30 years later, Vasily Leontiev said the importance of humans as a factor in production is bound to diminish in the same way that the role of horses in agricultural production was first diminished and then eliminated by the introduction of tractors. And 20 years later, the first of the real Nobel Prize winners, because those first two were Nobel Prize winners in economics, and those who know that's a bit of a fudge. This guy actually won a real Nobel Prize, a Peace Prize. And in his most recent book, he said, the trend is now nearing a threshold beyond which so many jobs are lost that the level of consumer demand falls below the level necessary to sustain economic growth. But it took a management consultant to capture that in the most pithy way. Tom Peters, for those that are old enough to remember Peters and Waterman in Search of Excellence, he said he predicted in the 1980s that the factory of the future would be staffed by a man and a dog. The man would be there to feed the dog, and the dog would be there to make sure that the man didn't touch anything. And most recently, we've seen all sorts of headlines suggesting that technology of various kinds is in fact taking over in ways that we haven't seen before. And not just taking over in manual roles and manual jobs, but actually taking over in jobs which we once considered quite high-level white-collar jobs. I have to confess I'm not much of this on one hand and then on the other type person. I figure you've got to make a decision, and I suppose you at least expect me as the speaker from here to have come to a conclusion about all this, and I have come to the conclusion that in fact it's the last lot of prognosticators that are right. This time, to disagree with Ross Gittins is different. It seems to me that there are at least two compelling reasons why we should be seriously worried about the capacity of our economy to create the jobs that we need. And the first does take us back to robots and other forms of automated technology. When The Economist considered this issue during last year, they used what I think was a very prescient title for their piece. They called their piece Immigrants from the Future. One of the characteristics of the discussion around this world of work for many, many years has been that immigrants are stealing our jobs. It's one of the arguments used against allowing some of the people who are trying to come to Australia to get into Australia at the moment and in other countries of the world. And The Economist envisaged a group of immigrants that were of a different kind to the one that we've normally seen, but nonetheless, they seem to think that perhaps these immigrants from the future might have an impact on the workplace. How much of an impact? Well, last year, a couple of Oxford University scholars did a very serious study of every single job classification in the United States. You should all know that we have a job classification system here too. Well, the US has one. They went through every single job in that classification, and they came to the conclusion that 47% of the jobs in that classification were in imminent danger based on current technology of being replaced by a robot or some other form of automated technology. 47%. When this research was quoted in Australia and brought to Australia, the commentator from The Conversation, one of the journalists at The Conversation, put it this way: so if a computer can drive as well as you, serve customers as well as you, and track down information as well as you, just whose job is safe nowadays? So one reason why I think this is different is because we now have the technological capacity to do without human beings things that for most of human history we've required to do with human beings. The second reason why I'm convinced that this is a problem has to do with something people don't expect futurists to do. People expect futurists to look only in one direction, forwards, but in fact all good futurists know that before you begin a journey into the future, you should first look into the past. And I want to look at a trend in Australia that has been consistent for 50 years. And I figure by anybody's standard, a 50-year trend ought to be considered a reasonable thing to be at least thought about. And that is the percentage of all the jobs in Australia that are full-time. In 1964, it was 93%. By 1984, it was 75%. And in 2014, it's 67%. We have a consistent 50-year trend of replacing full-time jobs with part-time jobs. Now, some people think that's a good thing. It's certainly made a very profound difference for women at work. It has certainly meant, this trend has meant that a huge number of women who once were not able to enter the workforce are now able to enter the workforce, and increasingly are able to come in and out of the workforce as their life course changes. So there is no doubt this has been a huge advantage to at least that group of people. There's also a group of people who have turned it to their advantage in a whole variety of ways. Those who were at Steve Shepherd's presentation yesterday heard these people described as selfies, the selfie generation. Those who are interested in looking after themselves and making things work for themselves. This particular, I'm sorry, I'm a step ahead of myself. Before I get to Steve got me excited because he's in the audience. This is what I've said. Part-time is not only increasing for women, it's also increasing for men. So the percentage of part-time jobs is going up. And in fact, in America, it is even worse than it is in Australia. As you'll see, fewer than a half of US adults are currently working full-time. That has a lot more to do with the fact that the minimum wage in America is vanishingly small than it has for us. And also, the number of people actually engaged in the workforce in America has come down. Ours has remained remarkably stable over this period of time. Back to selfies, I didn't call them selfies, I just happened to be in Steve's presentation yesterday. My particular researcher talks about the rise of the gig economy. The idea that once upon a time we did a job, now we participate in gigs. We get hired for a particular purpose or a particular period of time. Another phrase that's used, you'll see down the bottom there, is contingent forms of labour. So this increase in part-time jobs has provided new opportunities for all sorts of people that they didn't have before. It's allowed women into the workforce, it's allowed people of all ages to craft or create what Charles Handy once called a portfolio life for themselves. So it's been hugely beneficial. So, these are the organisations in this gig economy, at least some of them. And I put these slides in after Steve's presentation yesterday. Forgive me, Steve. Because these are some examples of them, and there are lots and lots of them. But it's worth reminding ourselves that these are commercial organisations. They exist not to make society a better place, not to create employment for people. They exist because they are considered efficient and effective for the people who use them. And at least one of them has run into difficulty recently. TaskRabbit is a large one. And what TaskRabbit has done, it's had a number of complaints from people who post jobs or tasks on TaskRabbit. And the number of people who have responded to those tasks has been so large that the people posting them have said that we're overwhelmed, we're swamped. It's a bit like you when you advertise for a job, or it will be if Joe Hockey gets his way and every unemployed person has to submit 40 applications a month. You'll be overwhelmed. Joe Hockey gets criticised in the media. What TaskRabbit did was to say, OK, we understand the problem, we'll fix it. So what they did was they tweaked their algorithm so that the only people who actually got to be able to respond to a particular task first were those who were already successful and had already done lots of jobs and could be known to be relied upon. The new people didn't get in unless none of those people got the job. And so a number of people were complaining that in fact this economy was helping some, but not by any means helping all. And my interest in this presentation is at a macroscopic level. There is no doubt, no question, that the changes that are taking place in the world of work are benefiting some people. They're benefiting a particular class of people. The question I'm asking is, what impact does this have on us as a society? This is a chart from America which looks at the real unemployment rate. Most of you should be aware, because you're HR practitioners, that the unemployment rate is a fudged statistic, and we won't go into the debate about the fudge, so don't worry too much about the numbers. The important thing about that graph is 5 years after the global financial crisis, they still aren't back to where they were, and neither are we, in terms of the number of people who are accessing employment. Economists talk about a shift in the balance between income, the proportion of income that goes to capital, and the proportion of income that goes to labour. That's a very common statistic, and one way of comparing those two is to have a look at what's happening to GDP, which is to have a look at what's happening to overall income in an economy, and then to have a look at what's happening to increases in unemployment, which is a reflection of the overall share that the workers are getting of income. So here's Australia, and you can see that Australia's GDP's gone up by a huge amount, employment's gone up by a lot less. It's not just Australia. There's the graph from America, and there's a graph from graphs from 4 other countries. In every single country in the OECD, the share of national income that is going to labour is decreasing, which means the share of income going to capital is increasing. Give a statistic about this. One of the books that's worth reading on this subject is called Lights in the Tunnel. And in Lights in the Tunnel, Martin Ford points out that in the 1960s, the largest employer in the US was General Motors. And in 2014 dollars, the average employee at General Motors was paid $29,000 a year and had health benefits and guaranteed employment. In 2014, the largest employer in the US is Walmart. Their average employee in 2014 dollars takes home $17,000 a year with no health benefits at all, because most of them are not permanent employees. And another way to look at that is this graph of the average income generated in various modern companies and historical companies per employee. And you can see just how much income for the company is being created in some of these high-tech companies. Large amounts of money are being shifted to capital from labour. We're even paying blank, empty parking spaces the same as we're paying 1.5 million low-paid Australians. So, what does this really matter? Does it really matter? Is it just a matter of getting another better set of policies? Well, in order to try and understand whether it matters, we need to take a minute and have a look at the way our economy actually works. From an individual's perspective, our participation in the economy has two components. The first part is we want to do something useful. Yes, we can't ignore that, and I must not pretend that in this presentation I'm not talking very much about what people are doing at work. That's a very important factor which has been hugely significant throughout this conference, is what are people actually doing and what benefit are they getting. But the second reason we go to work is because we need to earn the money that we need to live the rest of our lives. So from an individual's perspective, that's what the economy looks like. From the global perspective, from the whole economy perspective, it's all of those people going to work and all of their income that actually creates demand for the stuff that everybody else is making. So in order to have the sort of demand to buy the products that are being made, we need to have people at very least get the income that they need to buy that stuff. And if they don't have that income, then what impact does that have on the economy? So much as this presentation is about jobs and employment, at its core, it's really about money. It's really about how money is created and distributed and how people get access to money in our economy. And on this subject, at least, Ross Gittins and I agree. So he agrees that this is how the economy is supposed to work, that the more workers you have, the more demand there is. So, okay, if the problem is significant, and I hope I've convinced you at least to suspend your doubt about whether it's significant, then to borrow the title from another book that's very much worth reading, what then must we do? If this is a real problem, if we are seeing an irreversible diminution in the number of people who'll have access to jobs and employment in a way that allows them to live their own lives and make a meaningful contribution to the economy, what are we to do? Well, first conventional solution is to decide that it's a skills problem. We've heard a lot about that in this conference. That the real issue is that the people who are being displaced are simply not capable of taking the new jobs that are being created. And that what we ought to do is to retrain them as quickly as we possibly can, perhaps relocate them to other places. But fundamentally, the problem is a skills shortage. And if you take away the fact that we now have the capacity technologically to replace so many jobs with automation, you might even believe it. But that's the conventional solution. That's where we are currently. We're in a mad rush to try and work out how to skill people, although, as lots of people have pointed out, we're not skilling them anymore. They have to pay for it themselves. And they have to go deeply in debt in order to get these qualifications. And in fact, in many cases, you get one chance to get a qualification. You can make a choice to get a qualification, and then after that, the government doesn't pay anything. You have to pay everything yourself. But that's the first conventional solution. The next one after that, it goes back to Tim Ferriss and his 4-hour working week. The idea that we would all get this sort of collective dividend from all of this wonderful automation and reduce working time. Haven't seen much of that. Average working hours in Australia are higher now than they've ever been. About 44 hours a week on average, people in Australia work. Nonetheless, this issue of trying to create shorter working times has been tackled seriously around the world. Some of you may know that the French in the year 2000 mandated a 35-hour working week. They actually instituted police who would travel through the streets of cities, and if they saw your light on after 5 o'clock, they were allowed to come into the building and check your timesheets to see whether you'd worked more than 35 hours a week. It lasted about 8 years before it was chucked out as ridiculous and unworkable, but they made a go at it. In the most recent global financial crisis, the Germans came up with a nice solution called Kurzarbeit, which means short work. What they did was, instead of leaving everything in the hands of individual employers, they said to individual employers, if instead of sacking people, you reduce their hours, the German government will top up their wages. And one of the reasons why some people think that the German economy has survived better and is leading Europe is because that's in fact what they did. What we said in this country was we have a free market, employers can do what they like, and then the government picks up a dole check for the entire fund. What the Germans did was to say, you reduce, we'll top up. So there have been a variety of things done. I could give you some other examples. There are some other amusing examples from around the world, but there's a solution. There's a potential solution. I've mentioned the government. The next obvious solution has to involve the government. If people can't get access to income through employment, then one possible way for them to get income would be for the government taxation. The government already does that. One of their jobs is to collect taxes and redistribute it. There are about 5 million Australians who already receive benefits from the government, about 2 million on the age pension and 3 million other things. And various people who've addressed this question, who've come to a similar conclusion, have come up with some quite creative ways of thinking about alternate ways in which the taxation system could be used. They point out, for example, that we have payroll taxes, which tax an employer according to the number of people that they employ. There's no equivalent tax for robots or technology. So you might introduce a robot tax as you have a payroll tax, and the government might use that extra income to provide for people. They also point out that all of a company's salaries are considered a tax deduction. So if you pay your chief executive $100 million a year, that's $100 million a year tax deduction that you could write off. And one of the things we've seen is a great increase in salaries at the upper end of the scale. So some people have suggested that, in fact, the tax system should be adjusted so you can only claim a percentage of a person's remuneration as a tax deduction. And at the lower end, perhaps you don't claim, you can claim it all, and at the upper end you only claim a short amount and you use that and redistribute that to a bunch of people. Some other people have just said, if all this money is going to a smaller group of people, well, let's just forget it and tax them. Let's get rid of some of the benefits that you have by being rich, negative gearing and all those sorts of things. Let's adjust the tax scale so that we get some more off the people that have it, and then the government redistributes that, presumably, to those that haven't got it under this system. And then for those economists really among you, you might recognise Arthur Pigou and have heard of Pigovian taxes or Pigouvian taxes. This is the idea that you tax things that you don't like in your economy. We had one of those. It was called the carbon tax. We got rid of it. But the idea is that in smoking, you put huge amounts of tax on cigarettes, and the idea is that you do gain some revenue from those who persist in the process, so that becomes taxation revenue. But it's also a way of adjusting the way your economy works, and there's plenty of potential for those that study economics for ways in which the government might raise all sorts of different forms of taxation and perhaps redistribute that. It's not very popular in modern Australia to talk about governments owning things. But another possible way of dealing with this problem would be for the government, instead of taxing and then redistributing the taxation, if the government actually owned things, then perhaps the dividends could be redistributed. So government could own enterprises in various ways, and then the income stream from that could be distributed to various people. We have a version of that in this country and about 40 other countries around the world. We call ours the Future Fund. Collectively, they're called sovereign wealth funds. And the idea here is that various percentages of government revenue are in fact invested in various productive enterprises. The idea is that some of the income from that goes back to fund government activities, and generally the corpus grows over time. There are about 40 of these around the world. Oops, wrong way. One of them is in Alaska, which in the Alaskan equivalent to our Future Fund has been going for about 30 years now and has about $50 million in value. They've taken an interesting approach since the 1980s. They actually distribute the entire income from that fund as a dividend to every citizen, man, woman and child, every year. You can see that it goes up and down according to the benefits that they get, but every Alaskan gets a cheque once a year for somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000. It's another way in which this dilemma might be dealt with. Some people who've looked at examples like this have gone a stage further, and they've said, okay, if you don't like the idea, if you want to think about taxation, not too sure about taxation, another way of dealing with this, I'm sorry, before I do that, I should say that, again, Gur Alpovitz points out that if the entire American GDP was redistributed equally to Americans, everybody would have about 50,000. So it's that sort of thing that led people to say, well, if that's what distribution might mean, then rather than thinking about the government rewarding some people who can't get a job and taxing those who have one, what about the idea of a guaranteed minimum income, a citizen's dividend, if you like? We live in a very rich country. The idea that the government provides everybody with a single guaranteed income every year. There are various of those around the world. Many people don't know that Richard Nixon nearly put one in America in the 1960s. But it's not very much on Australia's agenda, but it's one of the solutions that's been proposed. Some people go further than that and say, well, don't just give them a guaranteed minimum income because that sounds a bit like Joe Hockey's entitlements. And we've got to end the age of entitlements. So instead of doing that, let's encourage those who do make a bit of a contribution by having what they call a negative income tax. So the idea, if you are making a contribution and earning some income, you actually get rewarded for that. You get a bonus back from the government. America has one of these in place at the moment. It's called the Earned Income Tax Credit. So it's something that does exist in various places. So governments might own things and provide dividends. Well, if we want to take governments out of the picture altogether, what about the idea that we own more stuff ourselves, more businesses ourselves? There's lots of research around to suggest that employee-owned businesses make qualitatively different decisions about how they manage their employees. You may or may not be aware that 2012 was the year of the cooperative. As various people have suggested, we should try and get more people into owning their own businesses. And if they own their own businesses, they not only might get a job from the business, but they might get an income stream. The global best practice benchmark for this is a group of cooperatives from Spain that were formed in the Basque region of Spain after the Spanish Civil War, where the Basque region fought on the wrong side of the war. So after Franco came to power, he just ignored them. Those of you who are watching politics at the moment might know they're trying to secede from Spain for this reason. But back 50 years ago, they created what is now a multi-billion-dollar series of entirely worker-owned cooperatives who do all sorts of things in and around Europe. And they are entirely and completely 100% worker-owned. In recent times, and less in Australia because we tend to have much larger energy distribution networks. Ours are state-based. In the States, lots of the energy distribution and generation facilities in the States are more regional and locally based. And what we've started to see is that they've started to buy their own power facilities. And so they're generating power for themselves. So we're starting to see worker-owned energy generation, and they're investing in new technology in a whole variety of ways. We even have our own example here in Australia with things like community banks. It is now in 250, nearly 300 communities. One of the banks that's available in your local community is a community-owned bank. And the dividend from that community, not only the dividend goes back to the local community, but their hiring decisions are made on the basis of local conditions, local circumstances. So another way we might deal with this problem is to get people to own things. Well, if you want to go beyond own, maybe we don't just want to own, we want to grow and make our own things. So there's a growing movement for people to drop out of the economy altogether. Drop out of the paid economy, become more self-sufficient in a whole variety of ways. The high-tech trend of that is the 3D printer, which is going ahead in leaps and bounds in what it can make and do. Here's the bloke sitting at a 3D printer with some of the things that have been made. These are now very cheap and very accessible. They can't do a huge amount of useful stuff, but they're getting better every day. So maybe we can actually provide for ourselves. So if you take that to the next logical conclusion, some people have said, okay, well, if this is all about that, well, let's encourage those sorts of businesses to flourish and develop that are local and provide things at a local level rather than thinking about huge business. America have what they call the Jobs Act, Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act, which is a deliberate attempt to reward the sort of entrepreneurs that are never going to become Google and Facebook, but are going to operate at a local level and make things happen at a local level. Some people have taken it a stage further and said, okay, if robots are going to take over, why don't we give everybody a robot? And when you're born, you get yourself a robot and you earn whatever income it makes during your life. Well, here's a bloke who makes robots, which he reckons he can make and provide to people for about $2,000, and they're incredibly well programmed. These guys that I mentioned earlier in the lights oh no, sorry, I haven't mentioned them. In Race Against the Machine, these guys take that concept of owning your own robot a stage further. They point out that success in the future is going to be less about robots and humans separately. It's going to be about robots and humans coming together. They call it the IndyCar 500 effect. No driverless car will ever win Indy, and no person on its own will ever win Indy. They have to work together. So there are all sorts of suggestions about ways in which this technology can be combined with people. You've got Threadless, the T-shirt place, where you can come up with anything you like and you can get the T-shirts made and distributed entirely by Threadless and make lots of money out of T-shirts. You've got God knows how many apps available on computers that are being built by all sorts of people. So it's a case of humans collaborating with technology in some way to make things happen. Another internet guru, Jaron Lanier, takes another spin on this. He points out that much of the internet at the moment relies on its success. Many of the companies that are incredibly successful in the internet economy at the moment rely on us doing things for free. Facebook, Google, all of those, Instagram, Twitter, all of those are aggregating data from us and then selling it on to advertisers for which they're making a fortune and we're providing it for nothing. Lanier says that's crazy. Why don't we get a share? And his suggestion is that the internet ought to be set up in such a way that each of us can get a little dividend every time our information is used by somebody in some way. He thinks it's about the way in which we think about accounting for what's happening to people. So there's a whole variety of potential solutions, and there's one more that I have to consider, because fundamentally this comes down to a question of money. As I said earlier, this is about jobs and employment, but the real question is, how do people get access to the money that they need to make their contribution to the economy? And money is one of those things that we hardly ever think about until we don't have any, and then we get to worry about it a lot. The rest of the time, it just drifts along. We might think about how much we're getting, but questions about how money is actually created, where it actually comes from, and who decides how much there is beyond most of our thinking, until we get a huge crash, something like happened in 2008, when all of a sudden, trillions of dollars that we thought existed suddenly didn't exist anymore. People who thought they had money, or more importantly, who thought they were owed money, suddenly found there was nothing around to pay them. The whole thing collapsed. This has not surprisingly led to all sorts of people coming up with new ways of thinking about money and how we might deal with money. People particularly damning about banks, because really there are only two ways in which money is created. It's either printed by a government in a note or a coin, and that never disappears unless you burn it. You can bury that under your bed and it's fine, unless you live in one of those countries where they wake up one morning and decide the old currency doesn't work, you've got to trade it in for a new one. We don't have that problem here. But that physical money is a vanishingly small percentage of the money that exists in the economy. Most of the money never realises anything other than an entry in a computer account, and it's created when a bank makes a loan, by and large. And lots of people have started asking the question, is the most effective way to run our money system to allow private individuals called bankers to make a profit generating this commodity which is so essential to what we operate under? What other business would be allowed to operate with loans of 93%? This is a reflection of the fractional banking system. Many of these changes that are being considered have been a result of this rather bland-looking seminal book written about 5 or 6 years ago, at least for those that are in this space, rethinking our centralised money system. Starting to ask the question, is this the best way in which we can operate? And for those that are up in newspapers, you'll see that these sorts of articles are beginning to appear in newspapers, recognising that in fact money is created at the stroke of a banker's pen when they issue a loan, and that much of what happened in the global financial crisis was that the loans they were creating weren't real. We thought they were. When we discovered they weren't, all of a sudden a whole lot of money disappeared. So are there other ways of doing this? Yes, there are. There are. And this is my final solution to the dilemma. And this is a particular story about a Boston, Massachusetts businessman who was going to set up a deli. And everybody in the community was really happy about this deli coming in because it was a brand new deli bringing all sorts of products from all around the world. It was going to be a wonderful thing. And a week before it due to open, it burnt down. And he didn't have insurance. He was devastated. And there were all sorts of things he could have done. And what he did was he issued what essentially amounts to IOUs to the local community. He said, I'm going to rebuild this thing. And in a year's time, I'll have this thing rebuilt. So what I'm going to give you is a voucher which says if you come into this store in a year's time, you can get a deli sandwich or you can buy $10 worth of stuff. And he sold all of those into the local community. And he took all the money and started rebuilding his deli. And what happened in the local community during that year was all sorts of people moved around and they needed all sorts of things. And these things started trading in the local community. And before he knew where he was, they had created what are now known as deli dollars. And deli dollars still exist, the deli still exists, and you can go into the deli and you can get food with American dollars or you can get food with deli dollars. And there are plenty of examples of various people who have been suggesting these sorts of things in various places around the world, and there's some examples of community currencies. The essence of these community currencies is to say, if our national economic system is incapable of recognising the value that exists at a local level, let's create a system which recognises that value. And since all money is based on trust, these systems work because people at the local level say, yeah, I can see the deli's going up, I can see that I'll be able to get a sandwich in a year's time, so I'm happy to take that note and hold on to it for a while. That's how it trades. Another version of that, not quite the same thing, but again very contemporary because of the decision of the Australian Treasury last night, for those that haven't heard, to decide that Bitcoin is not a currency. They've come down and decided it's not a currency. It's just like doing any other barter exchange, which is really interesting because California did exactly the opposite earlier this year. California decided that if these currencies exist in California, you can use them to pay your debts in California. So creating alternate currencies is another potential way out of this dilemma. I have to say, I feel a little bit like what climate scientists must feel like. I think we're facing a really serious problem that is going to make millions of Australians very angry. And even though I don't know which of the possible solutions is the best, I do believe that there are a whole variety of viable alternative ways out of this problem. But I know that we're never going to try any of them until we're prepared to face up to the problem. And at the moment, we're in denial. I do presentations like this in the hope that it will shift some of that thinking. That's it. Now, you get a chance to get back at me. So there's about 10 minutes or so for questions, and we have a microphone here. So I don't expect to get away with all of that without being challenged in some way. So please.
You're right.
My name's Tom Landross, New Super. Great to hear your presentation. Not getting into having studied in Thomas many years ago. Do you know of a French economist called Thomas Piketty?
Yes.
What's your opinion on what he talks about? What happens in this problem?
For those that don't know, Piketty wrote a book earlier this year which was sort of one of those, it didn't quite go as viral as planking, but went pretty viral around the world, talking about 21st century capitalism. And it was a seriously researched book, having a look in particular at the way wealth distribution has gone, and particularly having a look at the fact that wealth seems to be aggregating in a small number of hands. And arguing, as many people have for a long time, that taxation is one way out of that dilemma. There's been a fair bit of criticism of Piketty's work because what he did, as distinct from many people who write these books, was he produced a website which had every single graph, every single chart, every single reference he used. And people have gone back into those references and questioned, and had a bit of a question. But fundamentally, I think the public reaction suggests that most of us are reasonably well aware that what Piketty's talking about is happening, that a group of people are being seriously advantaged. We're not quite so sure, I don't think, about how many people are being disadvantaged, but we know we're being squeezed in the middle, and we're very worried about that. And one of the things that Piketty does, and some of the people I've talked about, is try and propose solutions to that. And the fact is, I think there are plenty of solutions, and I think Piketty's got a lot to contribute. Gee, what does that mean? You knew it all already. You're like other people who don't believe it. Couldn't possibly be that serious. Ross Gittins is right. The jobs will always come back. Yes, sir.
I work in government and we have a lot of our enterprise funding coming up at the moment. Just feel that maybe individual bargaining, I know that's been before, more in a contractor type thing, so people have more control over what the conditions are. You said earlier in your presentation about how people can take their own destiny in their own hands.
Yeah, we are, unique's a much overused word, but we are a unique country in our industrial relations system. Up until the 1960s, it's one reason why 93% of all jobs were full-time in the 1960s, because we had an incredibly regulated, socially aware industrial relations system. We had, and it goes back to 1904, in a judgment called the Harvester Judgment in the Industrial, or was then called something else, but the Industrial Relations Commission, in which the justice said that the proper way to run a society is to pay the head of the household, of course the man, a living wage, a family wage. It used to be called a family wage. It got changed to basic wage after a while. And up until Bob Hawke became Prime Minister, we had this very centralised system, and every year there was some argument about how well it did its job, but the idea was that we had that structure. We've blown that apart now. And it's been a wonderful thing. There's no question it's been a wonderful thing. It's made all sorts of things possible that would not have been possible before. But like everything else, nothing is universally good and universally bad, or universally bad. And one of the consequences of blowing that apart is that those with less power have found it very difficult to negotiate in that environment. You know, if you think about shopping, if you worked for Myer in the 1960s, it was Myer's responsibility to find you work. You were employed from 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and possibly a bit on Saturday morning. That was all, because that was all the shops were open. And it was their job to find you work. If there wasn't enough work, they had to do something. In the 21st century, it's your job to find yourself work. If they don't need you after 11 o'clock, they get rid of you after 11 o'clock. And it's very difficult for individuals to compete against that. The theory is, and for some people it's proved correct. You work for Myer from 9 till 11, then you go home and do graphic design for somebody in Thailand between 11 and 2, and then you go pick your kids up from school, and then later that night you write a novel, which you publish. And, you know, that's the theory of this world, and there is certainly people who have benefited in that way. My argument is there are many more people who, A, have not benefited and are probably not going to benefit in the future. Yeah, two here. Well, the lady here and then the man at the back.
Thank you. Great presentation, very interesting. I really enjoyed it. If you had to pick one of your proposed solutions to how we might tackle this issue, I've been jotting down all the different scenarios you played out. What one stands out to you as perhaps having the most good or the most benefit or being in the best interest of the common man or the masses?
I'll take the question. I don't like single bullet solutions, but I'll take the question fairly, and my answer very clearly is community currencies. And why? For the reason I tried to give in the presentation. The trouble with our national currency system, there are lots of troubles with it, but one of it is that if I pull a gun out of my pocket now and empty all of your wallets, the money in your wallets is worth as much to me as it is to you. I've got it by illegal means, but it's worth the same. It has to be, otherwise we can't operate as a country. And so those who are controlling the supply of that currency have to think about it very carefully. And we've got a federal government at the moment, and I'm not going to be political. We've got a federal government at the moment who apparently sincerely believe that we're in the middle of a crisis and that there is not enough money to go around and that they need to ration this money in a whole variety of ways. And if we take them at face value, that's what they're doing. Now, the trouble is, there are a whole lot of us in our local communities who can see stuff screaming at us. There's never going to be... Jobs and employment might be disappearing. Work is never going to disappear. There always has been more work to do than there are people able to do it. And there always will be. But the trouble is, it can't be seen from Canberra, or it can't be aggregated in a way that Canberra can deal with it. The beauty of the idea of a community currency is that local people can decide that there's something of value happening here, and they can do something with it. Now, these community currencies have existed for hundreds of years, and there are plenty of examples where, there's some famous examples where towns have been destroyed by floods and they've come back through these currencies. The problem with them in the past has been that they can only... two problems. One, they can only exist within the local community. They're not worth anything outside. And the second is it's very hard to work out. They don't work on the basis of borrowing and investing. They're basically a transaction medium. Now, the beauty nowadays is that modern credit cards can contain multiple currencies on them. Every time you travel overseas, I've got an NAB travel card. It's got baht, Singapore dollars, it's got US dollars, it's got euros, it's got all those sorts of things. And if I run short of euros, it does the conversion for me and takes some Australian dollars out of my account and sends it off to euros when I'm in Europe. We have the technology now to allow people to have multiple of these if they want and to have them around. And then with our community banking system, with community banks, we have the opportunity to create a banking infrastructure around community currencies. So if I was going to advocate a solution, it would be on that basis. But it needs to be aggregated up at a level where it can operate across Australia. And I have to say, last night's decision with respect to Bitcoin is a good example of our government's never likely to, or not in the short term, likely to ever make it possible. So while they stay local and trivial, they'll never be a meaningful solution, which is why I'm reluctant to answer your question. But if I was only given one, that's what I'd fix it with. Sir?
I'm just interested in your views around, I guess what generically referred to as the lower skill, the manual type of worker, and the future for that sort of cohort.
Yeah. The short answer...
Sorry, because to your point, in some respects, the work's all going to be there. If I'm standing in the hotel,
Yeah.
you can see all these guys working on the construction site. I'm seeing them build things.
Yeah. Well, that's one way in which the work will still be there. There's still stuff that has to be done. I mean, with the best will in the world, no one's going to let, for a long, long time, a robot cut your hair. And that has partially to do with the fact that robots are not very good at that fine stuff. But the second reason is that to install a robot into a hairdressing shop is not worth it from the human person point of view. They can only do one thing at a time. So there are always going to be some things that need to be done. But my answer to your question is not at that level. So I don't think of it in terms of jobs. I think of it in terms of work. Think of the people you know who fit into that category of lower level skills and don't have anything to contribute. And ask yourself, what are they doing with themselves for 168 hours a week? It's true that the government thinks they're all bludging or they're all stealing or they're all smoking something, but the truth is they're all participating in society in a whole variety of ways. And the trouble we have at the moment is we don't have a way of valuing that contribution in a way that provides anything meaningful for them. So again, I don't think the issue is one of skills. There is a skills shortage. If you're running BHP and you're going to do what BHP does, there are a whole raft of skills you're going to need. There is no question about that. But our economy, our society has a whole lot of other things in which everybody participates. And the question is, how do we make it possible for them to meaningfully participate? And, a guaranteed minimum income, for example, if you said, use the American example, if the American economy was divided equally, everybody in the country would get $50,000. So think of your typical family structure, and it's not typical anymore, but you've got a family of four, so 2 kids and 2 adults, 200,000 is a bit much, that's a bit rich. So let's say we give them, 75,000 between the 4 of them. The other 125 can go off to do other things. What could a family of 4 do with $75,000 if they had it? The problem is the way we've said they have to get it up until now is either to go cap in hand and beg to the government for it and say, excuse me, I'm now marginalised for some reason, please respect my marginality and give me some money, or you have to go and get a job. That doesn't reflect what our society needs doing and needs getting done. We need some other ways of thinking about how people access those things. So I'm not at all worried about even anybody's skills. There are very, very, very few people who are not able to make a contribution. It is our current system that gets in the way of them making that contribution.
And,
is that it?
Yeah,
we're done?
Thank you very much, Charles. I'd like you to thank Charles, I think, as a, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Both as a researcher and academic, there was lots of food for thought, but as an HR practitioner, the thought of robots as employees was quite... see opportunity there.